So before we get started with chapter 18, it's very important that you understand parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems and how they regulate functioning organs. So this first slide here is a very good example of how parasympathetic and sympathetic affect the organs. If you look to the left under the parasympathetic, what I would do is make a nice list or chart, whatever you prefer, and note the differences between the two. Obviously, it's going to be the opposite effect between parasympathetic and sympathetic. So under parasympathetic, for the eyes, you're going to see a constriction of the pupils. Parasympathetic will stimulate salivation, slow the heartbeat, constrict bronchi, stimulate digestion, stimulate bile release, stimulate peristalsis and secretion, and contraction of the bladder. Under sympathetic, you're going to see the opposite. So the eyes will be dilated, salivary glands will be inhibited, the heart rate will accelerate, there's a dilation in the bronchi. In the stomach, there's going to be an inhibition to digestion. In the liver, it stimulates glucose release. In the kidneys, stimulate epinephrine and norepinephrine release. That's important to take note of. You see under parasympathetic, there's not really a designated impact on the kidneys. So you obviously need to keep that in mind for the sympathetic effect. Intestines will inhibit peristalsis and secretion instead of stimulate. And for the bladder, you're going to see that the bladder is relaxed under sympathetic. So now let's get started with chapter 18, adrenergic drugs. Adrenergic drugs are drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, or the SNS you may see from time to time. It's just the abbreviation. They're also known as adrenergic agonists or sympathomimetics. They mimic the effects of the SNS neurotransmitters, or catecholamines. You have norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. Adrenergic receptors are located throughout the body. Receptors for the sympathetic neurotransmitters are alpha-adrenergic receptors, beta-adrenergic receptors, and dopamine receptors. Dopamine receptors respond only to dopamine. Alpha-adrenergic receptors, so you have alpha-1s and alpha-2s. Alpha-1s are postsynaptic effector cells, so those are related to tissues, muscles, and organs. Alpha-2s are the presynaptic nerve terminals, so they are in charge of the neurotransmitter release. The responses from our alpha-adrenergic agonists are vasoconstriction and CNS stimulation. Then you have betas, beta-adrenergic receptors. They are all located on postsynaptic effector cells. You have beta-1 adrenergic receptors located primarily in the heart, and beta-2s adrenergic receptors located in smooth muscle of the bronchioles, arterioles, and the visceral organs. Then we have dopaminergic receptors. So in addition to adrenergic receptors, they are stimulated by dopamine. They cause dilation of the following blood vessels, resulting in increased blood flow. So the blood vessels that they affect are the renal, the mesenteric, coronary, and cerebral. Catecholamines are substances that can produce a sympathomimic response. They are endogenous. So those include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Or they can be synthetically made, like dobutamine or the phenylephrine. So what's the mechanism of action? This is important to understand. They have direct acting or indirect acting. So direct acting binds directly to the receptor and causes a physiologic response. The indirect causes the release of the catecholamine from a storage site in the nerve endings. Catecholamine then binds to the receptors and causes a physiologic response. You also have mixed acting. So what this means is they can directly stimulate the receptor by binding to it, or they can indirectly stimulate the receptor by causing the release of stored neurotransmitters from the vesicles in the nerve endings. Indications include reduction of intraocular pressure and dilation of the pupils. So treatment of open-angle glaucoma include the alpha-adrenergic receptors. Examples would be epinephrine and dipephrine. Temporary relief of conjunctival congestion in the eyes. Once again, it's an alpha-adrenergic receptor. Examples of this would be epinephrine, nafazoline, phenylephrine, and tetrahydrozoline. Treatment of nasal congestion. So intranasal or topical application causes constriction of dilated arterioles and reduction of nasal blood flow, thus decreasing congestion. It is also an alpha-1 adrenergic receptor. Examples include epinephrine, ephedrine, nafazoline, oxymetolazine, metazoline, phenylephrine, and tetrahydrolazine.